Yes, we are live. Hello and welcome to Product Lessons, a podcast channel where we talk to product leaders from all over the world and learn from them how they build and manage world-class software products. I'm thrilled to have with me Joyce Lin. She's the head of developer relations at Postman. And I don't have to mention about Postman. They're the world leaders on API management software, and they're branching themselves into different use cases and different solutions. I'm a big fan of Postman. In fact, being a product manager, I picked myself up learning about APIs, and Postman was the de facto tool for me because curl was always a challenge in command line, and Postman was my first user interface where I got to understand how to fire an API call and understand the dynamics of APIs. So a big fan of Postman, and I was so thrilled when Joyce agreed to be a guest on my podcast.
Oh,
So
yes.
welcome to Product Lessons podcast, Joyce. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting. I used to do product management a really long time ago. And like you said, product managers use Postman, but I typically talk to developers or testers. So I'm really pleased that we're going to be going through a line of questioning that is really specific to PMs. And I'm excited for today.
Same here. I'm excited too. And for the audience, this is early morning for Joyce, 7 a.m. And I want to thank again just for that effort.
Yeah, no
So,
problem.
so Joyce, before we get into the meatier stuff, I wanted to understand, what does head of developer relations mean? How do you describe your job?
Yeah, so developer relations is going to be different at most companies you talk to. So it's a very valid question that you're asking. What does it look like at Postman? So Postman is a developer tool used by technical, non-technical people nowadays. But in the beginning, it was strictly for, designed for developers to fire an HTTP call. And so developer relations is a way of talking to that audience directly instead of the traditional maybe marketing channels, maybe sales channels even. I'll tell you that I don't have traditional OKRs for marketing or sales, but it's really talking to that audience, and it's a two-way cycle. So sometimes people, so I have developer advocates on my team. And I always say the emoji that I use to describe advocacy versus evangelism, because some developer relations teams have developer evangelists. The difference in emoji is an ear instead of a megaphone. So it's more of a conversation than just a broadcast. Similarly, for product, you'd be in a world of trouble if you were just broadcasting and just saying, here's how you should use it and here's what it is. You kind of need to listen to your customer and understand their pain points and have a continuous cycle of feedback.
You mentioned a few things. You said developer advocacy, evangelist, and developer relations. Are they are they very different, or how do you differentiate them?
Again, it's different at different companies. So sometimes when people are saying developer evangelist versus advocate, sometimes they mean the same thing. But if somebody is differentiating in conversation with you, that's typically what they mean. You're advocating for the user versus evangelizing the product.
Got it. So if in a typical product company that has their own APIs, when do you think you should have a developer advocate or an evangelist?
I think it depends on how your startup started. So it's going to be really contingent upon the skill set of the existing team. If you have a lot of team members that are very good at the people relationships, having these one-on-one conversations with customers, potentially going to events, writing content, I think you can probably delay hiring a developer relations person to a little bit later. If you're brand new and you're greenfield, and your target audience is a technical audience, then it can never hurt you to invest in developer relations early on. I know our CEO, by the time I joined, they had already found product market fit. So it wasn't really about bringing awareness. It was more about education. And our co-founder CEO is really adamant that developer relations as a function is pretty valuable to startups that are for technical audiences.
I'm gonna come back to the target audience. All right. So it's a tricky thing because target audience users are the developers, but the target audience is the buyers or the decision makers need not be essentially developers. So I'll come to that. But just for a segue, smoother segue, I read your very, very interesting article on Hacker Noon, where you highlighted how the Forbes Cloud 100 list of companies has close to 99 of them either public or private APIs. What do you make of this observation?
So the Forbes Cloud 100 is supposed to be the most valuable cloud companies. And of course, if you're cloud, you're going to say you have APIs, you use APIs for sure. Yes, that's a given. But do you need to provide public or private? And I suspected that a good majority of those companies would have public or partner APIs. But it ended up being, I think when I first looked at the data, it was 96 out of the 100. And then by the time I posted the article, it was 99 out of 100. And so the takeaway there is that public APIs, public meaning just open to anybody can self-serve sign up, or partner, some sort of stage gated, a little bit more prestigious, a little bit harder to get into, like maybe a partner network or something. Public and partner APIs have become table stakes for the Cloud 100, and it increases your value that you provide. And then also that customers and consumers are expecting it. Like when you're shopping for a new solution, if they don't have an API, like that's just going to be a detractor.
Got it. Yeah. So for folks who are listening to us, and you might need some more context behind what public and private APIs mean, you could go and check out one of our past episodes with Vijay Bhaskar Rao, where we went deep into these fundamentals. So with Joyce, we are going to cover mostly about what does API first companies look like. So thanks, Joyce, for that context setter. So these are so these 99 of these 100 companies had public and private APIs. But I asked you a question on LinkedIn when you posted this, and I said, okay, does this mean these are all API first companies? And you said it need not be. So could you help us understand what, according to you, is an API first company, and what are its true characteristics?
Yeah, I feel like I keep hedging your answers, but it really depends, right? So if you're talking API first to somebody, make sure you understand the context and what they mean, because it varies person to person. What I mean by API first is probably not going to be the same as what somebody else says, but I talk to companies that identify as API first. And so that's the definition that I'm using. Some people, when they say API first, they means I have an API, or I'm API driven, or I have thought about the API, or I've exposed some functionality via the API. And so when you're talking to the people that are really leading the way in this API first movement, what everyone is talking about there is API design first, typically with some sort of specification like Open API. So it's designing very rigorously and comprehensively what is my API going to look like in a schema, and then pinning that down, circulating it to potential consumers, and then actually building it. So it's API versus code first. API first versus code first.
So rigorous and comprehensive schema, what would be the opposite of that? If an API effort without API design first. So I thought everybody would be rigorous about the schemas, right? So what is it that differentiates between a non API design first companies?
You are probably not using a schema. Not all companies use specifications, and some companies that use specifications aren't using them to design and inform the API. They're using it kind of on the tail end to generate maybe test or documentation. They're using the tool, but not for the intent of designing the API.
And what's the advantage of having an open API specification? Like, what does it bring value? How do you stand out?
So Open API is just a standard for the design. And so Open API is a pretty widely used industry standard. So for example, if you have partners that are going to be working with your public API or your partner API, they would understand the format, they would understand the functionality behind that schema, and the tooling that they're using and the work processes would be compatible. So there's a little bit of compatibility and understanding. The learning curve is much shallower because it's a familiar tool, because it's for the most part consistent. It's actually not. There's still a lot of subjectivity, but there's at least a standard.
In that case, why would anybody not follow Open API? Does it come with a cost? Is it more rigorous? When you said, why would anybody not follow these practices?
So some people are using their own specifications. There are some other standards out there. Some people have designed their own standards. Though it's kind of like, why would you follow an industry standard instead of rolling your own? That's the same kind of question. It is more rigorous. So for everyone, if you've come from no schema, which there's companies out there that are not using schemas, if you come from nothing to adopting it, then there is a little bit of a learning curve, and then you have to change your processes. And it's kind of like if you're a PM and you want to get all the consumer inputs, all the different consumer feedback, how much time are you going to spend on that versus I know what my consumers want and just going off and designing the requirements, defining the requirements around that?
Mm-hmm. I'm just sharing the screen for Open APIs just so that I understand. So does it come from Swagger IO? Am I on the right?
Yeah, so Open API rebranded from Swagger version 1 and version 2. In version 2, they rebranded to Open API. So there's still confusion about, some people call it a Swagger file.
Got it. And then, so ideally, they would just follow the specifications defined in here, right?
Yeah, so there's an Open API initiative. Actually, our chief evangelist is on that board. So Postman is very invested in Open API as a standard, but
Right.
the big companies got together and they said, "Hey, let's work together to define this definition." So with every version release, there's a lot of discussion. They have open meetings that you can attend if you care about the future of Open API, and they're collaboratively coming up with this specification.
Right. And does Postman help to have these specifications within the product, or how can we ensure that the specifications are applied in my schema?
Yeah, so that's like the tooling. We support Open API. We support Swagger too if you're still on V1. But Open API version 2 is the most widely used standard right now. The rate of growth for 3 is much higher, but V2 has huge market share. And so as an API tooling company, we do support the main standards.
Got it.
Yeah.
Excellent. My next question was, you said the definition of APIFirst differs a bit from company to company. But would there be a list of like is there a checklist saying that, okay, if I tick these 5 things, I am an APIFirst company, or you would not say that? What are so I understand. So Open API would be one of those criteria. What else would qualify you to be called as an APIFirst, according to you, if the definition is not consistent?
So if you look at the Venn diagram, I haven't thought through this, so let's just think out loud. If you think about the Venn diagram, if you're using Open API to design your API, you are probably API first. However, I will say that API first is an evolution. It's a journey. And so continuing to assess and say, am I offering functionality as an API first? Am I having my consumers, my initial internal consumers, as well as external consumers, consume the API and enabling them to do that? I think you can decide to become API first. You don't say, I'm going to be API first starting right now. But if you're using Open API to design an API, to design your APIs, then I would say that you are API first.
I see. And you mentioned about internal consumers as well. So that means mostly having different teams talk to each other also through APIs. Would that be also a consideration for APIFirst? Not just public APIs for your customers, but also how teams interact
Most
within?
definitely, yes. And so most organizations at scale, like Postman has a microservice architecture. And what that means is we have encapsulated little services that then are independent of their design, of their development, of their deployment. And so now exposing your functionality as an API first, even within the company, allows all of those little encapsulated bits to move more independently.
Got it. So there is no priority, like, okay, um, public should be APIs and internal. There's no step one and step two, right? So both the initiatives should be going together for building a robust API first culture, isn't it? Is that
Yes,
fair?
yes, correct. But the business people will need to decide at what point they prioritize. There was still one out of the Forbes 100, the Cloud 100, that did not have a public or partner API, and so not everyone will have a public API, but it's really becoming rare now that when people ask you, "Do you have an API?" It's rare when you're saying like, "Nope, don't have it," and not going to be considering it, not even planning it.
I get that. Maybe that the businesses is all about software products, and maybe it's very hard to imagine in today's time. But I'm sure that it has its own reasons not to be in APIs.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk about promoting your APIs. And since you talk to so many developers and you interface with so many companies, what have you seen as the best practices for API first companies to promote their API products or API solutions? What do you see are the patterns?
I see investment in API documentation, and API documentation is also a broad category of stuff that you can do. But even having API reference, like if you don't have API reference available to your user, which not every company does, unfortunately, just having well documented APIs and then providing some of the other documentation tools to onboard new users and also support existing power users. And so like one of the things that I see for developer experience is kind of a hot term right now, but it's really thinking about the developer and their entire user journey. And so Postman has something called the API network, where you can list your public APIs. Well, there's the private network where you can list your private APIs, but the public API network, you can go and look for all public APIs. And a lot of people know that people are using Postman to fire off a single call or learn a new API. And
Yeah.
so as a PM, if you're like, well, let me put my documentation in Postman and format it in a way that they could just push a button, that is huge. That's allowing them to get to their time to first call much, much more quickly. And sometimes you're reducing their onboarding time by days, just by setting something up in a way that's familiar to your user. Um,
Mhm.
in documenting it, getting started guides, advanced use cases, having code samples, building SDKs, all of that type of tooling and documentation that helps your user get deeper into your product.
So does Postman help you achieve all of this or most of it?
What did I just say?
You said
Um,
code samples,
Code
SDKs.
samples. Yeah. So there's no SDK generation, but there's code sample generation. So if you pushed a button and it's working in Postman, you could generate a code snippet and then plop it into your own application.
Nice.
But I would say, I mean, there's a lot of advanced functionality that people aren't even aware of. I would say the biggest thing that I think I find valuable is giving your user that first win, that first successful call that allows them to understand what your product is offering. That's the thing. Sometimes when I consume a ton of APIs very shallowly, but I consume a ton of them. And I'm always on people's marketing websites. I'm always in their documentation, just trying to figure out what does your product offer. And
Mhm.
sometimes product marketing managers get so wrapped up into let's talk about the benefit, let's talk about the feature, yes, the benefit more, but like they get so wrapped up into the precise wording that to the average user, like maybe it's not super clear because they're trying to tout the benefits.
All right, I understand that. So you mentioned about best practices. You mentioned, could let us know about a little bit more about API network? So are you saying API network gets you traffic also to your public APIs? Is that how it is, or?
It could, but it's kind of like posting it on the internet. It could be getting you
Hi,
could be
Joyce.
getting more traffic. Hello?
Hello, lost you for a bit.
Oh, am I back now? Ravi, can you hear me? Oh no, is it my internet?
Hi, Joyce. Yes, you're back.
Oh
No, no,
no.
no. It's. I think it's mine. But you're back.
Okay. I was saying that API network can get you traffic if there's people looking for your brand. But I would say the better reason to list in the API network is because, oh no. Ravi, where are you? I hope it's not my internet. Do, 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 do. Bum, 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 da, 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 da.
Joyce. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
My internet is misbehaving.
Oh, that's the worst.
All right, we are back. That's the good thing. Sorry, where were you, Joyce?
I was talking about the API network. You were saying, will that get
Yes.
me traffic? If I list my public API in the network, I would say that if people are searching for your brand, then yes, they will find it. There is discoverability. If they happen to be working with your base URL, like say you're consuming a public API and you start typing in the URL, there is something that says like, oh, did you want to look at this documentation? But I would say that the better use case is developer onboarding and smoothing out that experience and that journey, that first friction point where they're trying to authenticate an API call, or yeah, just simple things like copying and pasting from your docs. You've saved them one step.
Got it. If our listeners are API network, do you have, say, a YouTube video or something where it talks a little more in detail about API network?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and pull that up. Oh,
Yeah,
although I
or
don't.
maybe you could also share it on the screen. There's a share button, so maybe that would be helpful if you can talk a bit about, because this looks very promising. So what you are saying is, if you're a startup and you are constrained in your resources, you could use API network as is for developer onboarding, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll go ahead and share my screen.
yeah,
So I'm selfishly showing you Postman's YouTube homepage. But if you scroll down, we have a couple playlists. Oh gosh, I'm so glad you had me land here because there's something that I remember now. So here's a public API network. There's also the private if you're using Postman with your team. But here's a really nice brief video. I will give a shout out for I told you the chief evangelist of Postman, Ken Lane. He is on
right.
the Open API Initiative board. He has a podcast show called Breaking Changes, not to compete with your podcast because it's apples and oranges, but he
Right.
talks with industry experts on API first. It's solely
Ah,
focused on API first. And it's
nice.
these important people. Like here's Chris over at Stripe, and he's talking to Stripe about how are you API first, sharing some of those war stories. And
Hi. How
yeah,
lovely.
yeah,
How lovely. I think this is rich content there.
yeah.
And let me tell you, Postman is not paying for this. This is not promotional content. In fact, this is the second time I'm speaking to somebody from Postman. The first time was Prashant Agarwal. I do not know
Yeah,
Joyce, Prashant, but
of
he's a
course.
product.
Everyone knows Prashant. Yeah.
So yeah, so I mean, it just goes to show how what a fanatic I am of Postman.
Oh,
Um, so with that, thanks Joyce for sharing that. I think people should check out, and I will definitely check out of all the content that you have. My next question is, what works, and more importantly, I think this was asked by somebody else to me, and he said, what works and doesn't work when marketing your API solution. So are there any best practices other than creating a robust developer experience, a robust documentation? And you also mentioned that you should not be wrapped around the messaging. In fact, you should make it really, really easy and intuitive for them to figure out what your API solves. Is there anything else that you think you have to add?
I would think this has more to do with the product development side, but what I've seen is that sometimes companies think that they're not ready to have a public API. They want it to be as feature rich as their regular, like, standard offering or what they already have. And so they're trying to replicate all functionality. I would say that you can move forward with a minimum viable product for your API. And in fact, we see a bunch of really good examples of Notion comes to mind. Notion is a productivity tool, and they had a beta API launch, and there was huge pent-up demand. Like, you're working in Notion and you're like, oh, I wish they had an API so I could do XYZ. And so there was huge pent-up demand for a public API. And what they did was they launched with a minimum viable product, and now they're layering on new functionality, and it's kind of an evergreen API. Twitter's another example that comes to mind. They have a developer labs API. They have a public API, V1, V2, and then they have developer labs where they're just playing with things, seeing how people react to it. And then at a certain point, they'll roll it into their standard API offering. But being able to experiment and gather that user feedback, I think, is pretty valuable.
Got it. I forgot to ask you, you mentioned about having great API documentation and API reference. I'm sure people ask you, hey, what are some of the best examples of API documentation reference? So what are the top one or two examples that pop into your mind when you say these are the gold standard for API documentation and API reference?
Ravi, it's like asking which of my kids is my favorite. It's really hard to say.
Okay,
I will actually say, if you go to the Postman API Network, I've personally talked with some of the people that create the documentation for in Postman, of course, but they're doing really, really great things. Just every time they raise the bar. It's at postman.com/explore, and there's
is that one?
Is that one? Or type in postman.com/explore, or actually browse the network is the button, the main button there.
Browse the network. Okay, here.
I will say that constantly there's people that are innovating on API documentation. You would say, like, it's API documentation. How innovative can it get? But
Right.
like, Twitter is one where they recently, on their main documentation, they do link to Postman. They do link to a live version of their Postman documentation. And then they also, recently, I saw one of their solutions engineers paired a backend on Glitch with it. So you're able to get back a response right away, maybe even if you don't have your credentials. A lot of folks are using sandbox environments so that they're just saying, here's an example of what you could expect back once you plug in your own credentials.
Got it. So I'm having trouble logging into. So it is asking for my login credentials. So let's ignore that for now.
You can also just go incognito. That's a secret.
Yeah,
I can share my screen.
Yeah, maybe. So what I'm looking for is some few examples. So you don't have to pick one or two of your kids, but you can give few examples there, and also why they are the better examples. So that would be good learning. Yeah, you could share your screen. I will stop mine.
Okay. How do I move my screen up there?
You just shared something while.
Yeah.
So you can click on share.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll do it again. I'll do it again. Sorry.
I found it. I have to add it to them.
Okay. So
yes,
okay.
I see it. All right. So that's where we are.
So I'm here at the public API network at /explore, and there's a bunch of, like, here's what's trending you can see, like, of course, Postman's up there because we make good documentation. There's communication, APIs, featured teams. I would say Stripe did a really good job. And Cisco DevNet, just off of what I see on this page. Actually, anyone that's featured here has done a decent job. But Stripe and Cisco DevNet really did a good job with their documentation. Salesforce and Microsoft also are killing it when it comes to the activity on their public workspaces.
Okay, so let's talk about, when you say good, I see the examples, but maybe if you can click on one of them. Yeah. I just want to understand what is good. Okay, when you say what are the traits that make them good. So what I'm looking at is their public collections, right?
Yeah, correct. So if you go through to like one of their workspaces, and they actually have a very broad product set. And so here they have so many collections by product, so that from their regular developer portal, they're linking to these collections. And so it's kind of like, instead of copying a curl request command from the documentation, they're coming here and pushing a button.
So help me understand. So there are these docs.companyname.com, and then there is this Postman,
URL.
what do you call this? Yeah, okay. What's the difference between the two? I mean, is this visible to the outside world, to their customers, to their organic traffic? Just help me understand, because I'm a bit lost here.
That's actually a good question, and I'm glad you asked it, because I don't think I've ever publicly articulated that confusion, but I bet a ton of people are like wondering the same thing. But this is a public API or public workspace. So this URL, I can send it to you and you can access it. And the developer portal that Cisco DevNet has is their own website. They control both entities, but this is a Postman collection. Well, this one is a Postman collection. It's a workspace with a ton of collections, and it's just one step closer to the user in their environment that they're going to be working in.
I see. And do they expose this link to Postman collection to this workspace from their developer portal?
I don't know about Cisco DevNet in particular, but they should. If they don't, they should. Right. Yeah. So here's an example
because otherwise, how else would a developer know if the collection is available on this network of Postman?
Because they're searching for it. So I just searched for Salesforce here, and I landed on Salesforce developers, and you can see this is their team. They have many fewer collections, but like, let's just see, like they have this many forks. So it's similar to a GitHub repository, public repository, in the sense that you can fork that repo to your own environment, and you can see how popular it is by stars or by forks.
So is it fair to say that you are competing, not just competing, you are offering a better alternative than creating your own developer portal? Is that a fair assessment?
I would say it's complementary. There's definitely people that don't have very robust developer portals that are choosing to invest in like a public workspace, but it's complementary. It's not.
So what is the complement here? The complement would be a list of all the collections that you can fire right away, instead of copying and pasting in your own API. What would you call API management software system or something like that, right? So like, for example, like I was testing some APIs this morning. I copied the curl from the developer portal, came to Postman, and then copied it and pasted it and then ran the query. You can avoid all of that hassle just by going to this, right? Is that how it is?
Correct. I love curl, and if it's just one single call, I'd be fine saying, hey, developer, go ahead and copy this to your clipboard and fire this curl. However, like, look at all the requests in here. Are you going to copy every single one of those just to try it out? Like,
got it.
That's excessive.
Okay, help me understand. Let's talk about competition in general.
Yeah.
So are you the de facto, or like are such solutions available with other competitors of Postman as well?
I think there's other people that have listings or catalogs of public APIs. If you just Google, you'll be able to see some. But Postman is the biggest, just because we have a really big user base. And so, we just have relationships with a lot of people that have public APIs.
So is it becoming a trend where developers are actually going here and looking for your public APIs of the companies that they want to try out APIs? Is that how it is? Is that becoming a standard or something?
Yeah, I would say that I constantly use the search bar, and I'm like, oh, does does Notion have an API? Does this company have an API? I'll look here. I Google, but I also search in Postman. And what's even more compelling, I think, is kind of like that fear of missing out. If
Mm,
you have FOMO, um, I I think other people posted Twitter's collection before Twitter got around to it. So there's
I see.
probably yeah, it's kind of like a GitHub repo where anybody can launch something. And if
Mhm.
you're not owning your brand, then somebody else will be doing your documentation. I've personally created collections that are forked by the public because, I have a IoT light in my other room there and they didn't have a collection. So, but they had, they have their documentation. So I copied and pasted, created a collection, and then just published it out there. And now people fork my collection. I own their Postman collection.
Lovely. How many companies are we talking about? How in your network?
Thousands?
Thousands. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know the number off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So pretty impressive and also very very valuable, because this morning I was just doing that. I see a lot of value here. Thank you. This was very very
Yeah.
valuable.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. What do we have next? So let's talk about how APIs are sold by companies, right? So who are the decision makers? So usually, if a company has an API program and it has API products, even so, the way it would go is, of course, you would get some organic leads, or maybe there is some you have a sales team, and then they would go and get leads and get talking. But usually, it's not the developer who is the decision maker, right? So my question is, um, how do you make less tech aware business owner help make buying decisions on API? What have you seen? What has your experience been on somebody who is a novice, who is not new into API? How do those conversations happen? Are you aware of it, or is this beyond your
To
beyond you?
to sell your API, correct? Not to
That,
purchase.
to sell your APIs, yes.
Yeah.
So we talked
Um,
about promotion. Okay, we talked about promoting APIs and stuff like that. But the next level would be, okay, somebody really liked your APIs, or maybe you go and approach a certain lead and tell them about their APIs. But the conversation is not happening with the developers. They are the next level of in the chain of command, right?
yeah. I would say that it's infrequent that somebody is shopping solely on your API if your product is beyond API. If it's API only, which
Mhm.
some companies are API only, then that is your sole product and that's what you're peddling.
Right.
But a lot of times when you have other products, the API is part of the offering. It's
That's
one
correct.
part of the offering. And I was talking to somebody about this a while ago. API Handyman, I'm dropping all these like famous API people. API
Mhm.
Handyman was telling me that at the company he works at, he is an internal API evangelist. And so he guides other functions in their shopping process. So
Ah,
yeah. So he was talking about HR. HR wanted to adopt a new tool, and he said let's make sure they have an API. And because if potentially HR is a non-technical consumer, and so are they actually thinking that they need to have an API? So API Handyman is an internal evangelist. Sometimes there's like sourcing guidelines, there's tech consultants internally that are guiding potentially non-technical consumers in their decisions. And
right.
so I remember Postman was shopping for, I think it was an HR tool. And the HR tool said, of course we have an API. But when you click behind it, there was no API. It was one of those click tests to see how many
Right.
people were interested in the
Right.
API. But, for Postman, that's a no-no. We're not going to be purchasing any software solution that doesn't have an API. So my 2 cents in selling your API is theoretically it's a complementary part of your business offering
Right.
and it's table stakes.
Right.
That's why I'm so much of a proponent of getting a minimum viable product out there. It doesn't need to do everything, but it needs to do something.
Got it. Yeah, that was I did not double down on that topic. I forgot. So you said you do not have to have a robust API program and wait for it to mature before you can expose it. Instead, you can go ahead with whatever you have and try to learn from the feedback that you receive, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Postman is an API platform, and yet we have a public API. I would say that the very first public API that we offered was fairly rudimentary, and it wasn't until a little bit more recently that we were able to restructure and invest a lot of time into our public API. And now you see all sorts of new features being offered by API. So
Got it.
at least we had something that people could use to roll their own solutions. And
Got it.
then later on, we were able to find the time to invest.
How does sales look like in an API company? So do you get yourself? How do you train your sales team? How do you equip them to be confident and successful in selling API solutions? Or does it need a certain skill set to sell APIs?
I think if you're selling API solutions, then you're going to be heavily investing in your solutions team, your solutions engineers, your partner engineers. A lot of times, even if it's not the API solution that you're selling, a lot of times SEs will be demoing their tech using API. So they're going to build a little proof of concept for a customer, potential customer, and then demo it. A lot of times they demo it in Postman, and that's how we get to talk with SEs.
Right. So when you say SEs, you mean software engineers?
Sorry, solutions engineers, or
Solutions engineers.
yeah,
Got it.
or solutions architects. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Excellent. My next question is, what is the level of expertise, and this is also I got from the audience, what is the level of expertise support should have to resolve API support requests? Not sure if I understand this right, but do you get a hang of it? Because API consumers might have a lot of questions on APIs that they're consuming, right? So what is a good best practice to build a well-functioning, effective, and efficient support to resolve such API requests?
Yeah. So my 2 cents is that your support engineers should at least be API literate. Even if they're not the ones fixing issues, they're at least able to reproduce the issues and replay them for the person that is ultimately going to be resolving bugs. So reproduction, that's a repro. Reproducing bugs in Postman is a reason why support engineers use Postman. There's all these like personas that use Postman. So that's my experience with how support engineers are actually consuming or test consuming APIs.
Right, and you do a good job in democratizing, abstracting the technical aspects of APIs by making it more user friendly, so that people with varying levels of expertise in APIs can still be comfortable with it, isn't it?
And that's a requirement nowadays. APIs are so much more ubiquitous. It's
Yeah.
almost an expectation. Like they're teaching APIs in like I don't know, children coding. Yeah. Oh yeah, kids are
Yeah,
learning
of
about
course.
APIs nowadays. Yeah.
Yeah. What are the best practices to communicate to users in the API first companies? I think we talked about that. Yeah, communicate as in yes, communicate as in roadmaps, communicating downtime, communicating changes in APIs, communicating alerts about usage limits. Yeah, these are the kind of, because API maintenance is again a big nightmare, right? And the biggest challenge is how do you keep communicating about all of these changes to your customers in a timely and efficient manner, so that it doesn't break their existing APIs that they're managing.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. All of that checklist should be handled. One thing I will focus on is the deprecation. And I think there's a lot of nervousness around that. So how do you, I'm not going to wait, this is beyond my field of expertise, but that is one thing that people talk about. So for Open API, how do you deprecate different versions and then make sure that there's no breaking changes with new updates? That's something that the Open API initiative, it talks about in discusses amongst industry leaders, like how should we be handling this, everyone?
Okay, so are there tools to manage that? Because I have worked in organizations where we had to maintain multiple versions for a certain duration, and it was a nightmare. Um, so does post tools like Postman also help manage versioning and deprecation as well, or?
So there is versioning in Postman, versioning of your APIs. And I think that's always a business decision, how you choose to handle and how you choose to deprecate and how you choose to not stop supporting previous versions. So there is versioning in Postman. But what I was talking, a lot of times it supports other open standards like Open API. And this is beyond the scope of my expertise, but there is functionality or a feature in place to handle deprecation.
Got it. And how do you communicate all of these changes to the customers? Do you write emails, or what is the best way to communicate your downtime and changes, changing versions and stuff like that? Have
I can tell you as a consumer what I expect
Mhm.
is to be told with ample notice and repeatedly, because I'm not checking my email like all the time. And then just trying to minimize the downtime, trying to find like the optimal time for your primary user base. That's what I would expect as a consumer. And for the most part, it goes without a blip.
Yeah, but would email be an expectation, or where else would a developer know about these upcoming changes?
I think occasionally you might see headers, response headers. I'm not, this is what is beyond my field of expertise.
Mhm. Okay. Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, but there is a scope of being nearer to them than just email. Within as you said, headers could actually be, you can list out some upcoming changes to look
Yeah.
for. Okay.
So for Postman, we have the concept of watching entities. So you can watch an API. And what that means is that you'll be notified when there's changes. So if I don't care about the API changing in the future, then I will not watch it. It's the user's ability to watch something, watch an entity, and then say, yep, let me know when something changes here. And so that's, again, like what you're saying, being closer to the user, working backwards from where the developer is, and they're in Postman and they receive, I mean, there's an email notification for when something changes, but there's also like a notification bell in app.
In app, as in Postman app?
In Postman, yeah. So if I'm
Okay.
consuming an API and it
Right.
changes,
I see.
I don't even need to be consuming it. I previously consumed it and I chose to
Right.
watch it, and now I will be notified of changes.
Can you be notified of a change that is about to happen instead of after happening, so that they're
That would
ready? Or
be fantastic. So the way the logic works right now is you would need to take additional action. So you would need to
because you want them to give some time, right? So that you want them to be
soak
ready
time.
of
Yeah.
this. Am I giving you a few feature requests here or no?
I love that feature request. I'm gonna swivel over and report it. I will say that I was talking about this example earlier. Twitter does a really good job of giving consumers soak time on new features. So they
Mm,
have that developer labs, which in my mind is like a skunk works for APIs, where they're
mm.
like dreaming the biggest dreams and they're like, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And then gathering that product feedback before rolling it in. So their soak time, it's kind of like a canary build, if you will.
Mm. No, this is the biggest challenge. Not only in my present organization, but from my past organization, it was a hassle to send out emails to different customers and maintaining the versioning information and letting them know of the changes in the future. It was a big hassle. So, okay, thank you. How do you measure the success of your API solutions or API products? Is there a way to know that, okay, you are doing really good, you are so it's top notch? Is there a way to benchmark yourself, saying that, you know what, we are doing a good job with our API program?
Yeah. So there's standard, Postman uses a maturity model. So there's standard metrics like quality, performance, security, all of that gets graded. We have a little rubric that grades metrics like that. So you probably already have your own metrics. I would say I mentioned this earlier, and it's kind of propaganda. It's my soapbox that I will stand on. But time to first call, if you have a public API, time to first call is going to be the most important thing. And I'll tell you the reason why is you can have like X uptime, but if nobody's using your product, then like, what's the point? You can have the buggiest API, but if nobody's using it, what's the point? So time to first call for public APIs, if you look at your funnel, is you have people shopping. Maybe they're on your marketing webpage. Maybe they go over to your API documentation and then they make their first call. This part, if they never get beyond here, and so many people get stuck, like if you have to authorize something more than basic or even basic, that's like the maximum people will drop off there. So if you look at your funnel and you want to keep your funnel as this sloped as possible, time to first call is going to be your most important API metric.
So again, the reason I'm asking you these questions is how much of this effort should we put in ourselves and how much comes out of the box with products like Postman. So do you also offer measuring quality, performance, and security as part of your offering, or no?
Right now, the reporting that we offer is primarily around usage. There is kind of like ways to get at quality and performance, but they're more subjective. They're more qualitative than like hard, like as far as what's out of the box for reporting from Postman.
You mentioned about the funneling. So is that also possible with Postman, or this is something that's the best practice that you should follow within the organization?
It's a best practice. Right now, we don't tell you your time to first call. So if you have a public API, it doesn't say, wow, all of your users got stuck on this one part. You really need to fix it.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, that would be amazing. But what you can see is all the calls that are coming from Postman. You can see, this is what I recommend people take a look at how many calls are actually coming through Postman. Is that even a valuable channel for you to monitor and invest in? For most companies it is, but not every company is going to be different. The other thing is see how many people are searching for, like what are people searching for on your portal, and then invest there.
Time to first call should be your easiest API call, isn't it? I mean, you can have hundreds of APIs, but time to first call should be for your very minimal first easiest call. Is that how it is? Or?
Correct. Yes. Okay. It's your hello world of making an API call.
Got it. All right. Let's get into the meatier stuff. That is how to train your engineers to create best-in-class APIs. So you said, okay, follow convention, follow Open API, which I imagine would be the first thing, right?
So yes, having some sort of standard, adopting a standard. Yep.
Right. Do you also document, like, do the best API companies have a style guide of sorts within the organization?
Yes.
Or does Open API solve everything? Because I don't think Open API is a specification for the schema, but there are best practices that you also need to create, isn't it?
Yes. So it's going to be up to your team to decide what is your style guide. So Open API does have an open source enforcer. I don't know. Is it called like a linter? Is it called a style guide enforcer? There is an open source add-on called, I want to call it Spectral. It might be called Spectral. But running the guide against Open API allows you to enforce preset standards. So if your team has a governance person or a governance team and they've set forth these design guidelines, you can actually have them in there and then make sure that it's another stage gate.
Right, because I've seen that there's inconsistency in defining your endpoints. So are there best practices to do that? For example, there are some workarounds where you do not usually call a get. You use post also for get. Okay, so there is this inconsistencies. So how do you ensure that people are following set practices instead of cutting corners to just make it work, or it's a workaround?
Yeah, unfortunately, you need to establish those guidelines and be explicit. It's like any good test. You're not going to be able to test what you don't specify.
Got it. So the best companies, engineers, they have these kinds of style guides, just as you have one for coding standards, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, at scale, if you don't have that, you'll see it very apparently in your internal APIs.
Got it. And at what point does it make sense to recruit API architects for an organization to enforce such standards? Because usually what happens is a company evolves towards API first. They might not have API first when they began. They
Yeah.
have a business software, but now they see the need to integrate into the inner worlds of their customers, and now they suddenly feel the need that they have to educate the entire workforce, engineers, developers. Do you see a pattern where you recruit strong, solid API architects within the organization?
I don't know the answer to this, but I think your point is worth reinforcing. The API first, being API first is a journey, and Postman didn't launch API first. In the
Hmm.
beginning, we were product is out there. Okay, we need to add an API. And now oh gosh, things are getting complicated. We have 17 million users. We have how many engineers, how many different departments. We should probably do something because it's getting unmanageable. The pain is enough that now we are going to be moving API first. Similarly, do we need an architect?
Mhm.
Okay, the pain is enough that now we need to invest in setting standards across the company.
Got it. Got it.
That's
Because
a
I
that's a lagging way to do it, but that's what I see. Everyone has already felt the pain by the time they're talking about this.
got it. Also, I see a lot of API product managers. I mean, I just mentioned Postman has its own API product managers. Do you also have a feeling when to hire an API product manager, or is it the same scenario just as an API architect?
I think it's the same scenario. And then the other thing is that it's a signal in the company that it is an area of focus. So if
Hmm.
we had we have an API product manager, a team dedicated to our API. But if we didn't have that, it could get deprioritized, it could get overlooked. In the fact that we are establishing our public API as a separate domain, um, kind of elevates it and then protects the resources from getting reallocated to something else.
Got it. Excellent. The last one you may choose not to answer, or
Uh-oh.
maybe shed some light, which is about pricing strategies. Maybe it's not. I mean, the reason I'm saying you choose not to answer, maybe this is not in your purview or in your domain. But are you aware of some best practices in terms of pricing strategies for API first companies? How to price your APIs, or maybe you can lead us into some resources where we can find more information about it.
This is beyond my scope of expertise. However, I will say that one lesson that Postman has found about pricing or general product is that you need to decide what is going to be value added for your business model. So
Mm.
Postman has changed our pricing in, it pricing is a constant evolution too. You need to constantly be understanding the value that you're delivering to users. And if that
Right.
value goes up, maybe you have a price hike. Um, but we have been doing like a version of freemium for quite some time now. So there's so much that you can do if you're a small team or you're just using the basics, or even like some of the advanced features, we just rate limit. It's just once you get to a certain point, and
Right.
as a consumer, nothing pains me more than not having a tier where you can play around with stuff. Have a
Got
hobbyist
it.
tier, have a free tier.
Got it.
Give them a taste of your value, especially if you don't have a huge user base.
Right.
That is particularly important. Don't let them feel the pain when they're just kicking the tires.
Got it. You should make it easy for them to first try it out, try before you buy, isn't it?
Yes.
Um, Coming back to API network has caught my fancy.
Yeah.
How does, so first of all, talking about pricing, is there a price to that, or how do you register yourself into API network?
No, there's no price to that. And if you think about the reason why, it's because of network effects, right? So put on your PM hat and it's the more the merrier. And then the more valuable this is to it's doing a good. The API providers have 17 million users to expose their API to, and consumers can find anything that they're looking for in
Got it.
the
So how does one get themselves registered into API network?
Um, there's a short checklist. It's
Got it.
essentially spinning up a public workspace.
Got it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, this brings us to the end of a fascinating conversation with Joyce. Joyce, I thought there were so many aha moments for me. I've been a big, curious a child of API, and every day is a lesson for me, and it's endless. The scope and how much you can learn about API is endless, and I plugged those gaps. This was a complementary conversation with you. We covered a lot of ground in some of my previous conversations with other API experts, including the friend from the product manager from Postman as well. So thanks a ton for shedding light into this, and all the best for the future for
Thank you,
Postman.
Ravi. This was a much meatier conversation than I thought I was going to be having on a Monday early morning, but this was so much fun.
Thank you so much, Jess. See you around. Bye bye.
Okay, bye.